Hey guys, I'm back with a new video, and today I want to talk about how Sony of Japan, specifically Kazuhiko Takeda, has, who is the head of Sony's corporate planning, has now acknowledged that the Nintendo Switch is something that they can't ignore as a company. Recently, Sony's Andrew House, I believe it was, um, had had said that the Switch wasn't really affecting Sony sales, and I think that when you look at it from a worldwide perspective, Sony's PlayStation 4 sales are still extremely strong worldwide, and they're having no trouble growing their business right now. But I think that when it comes to the Japanese element of Sony, which is still a Japanese-based business, um, the the media there tends to focus more on the Japanese market. This was an interview done by Nikia, and I'm sure somebody out there is going to be telling me I'm pronouncing that wrong, and that's because I probably am, but I'm doing my best. But anyways, the media in Japan is heavily focused on what's going on in Japan. And while Nintendo Switch has had a minimal effect on gaming, on Sony's market worldwide, if you look at it in a vacuum, it's true that the Switch has had an impact on PlayStation in Japan. And by PlayStation, I don't just mean PlayStation 4. If you take a look, the PlayStation 4 is still year over year for the year at large is likely going to end up selling slightly better in Japan than it did a year ago. And when you look at simply the Christmas selling season, which is, of course, the biggest selling season of the year, um, the PlayStation 4 is actually in a decline year over year. I did a lot of research on the numbers from this year and last year based on Media Create, which is the most reliable source of Japanese game sales information that we have at our disposal. The PlayStation 4 family, which is the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro, is down approximately 30% for the month of November. And I would expect that in the coming month of December, that they will also underachieve the year over year numbers. Last year's December in Japan for PlayStation, the numbers were enriched by the key release of Final Fantasy 15 in Japan, and they just don't have a key release like that coming up. If Monster Hunter World was launching now, it might be a different story. So I'm going to predict that by the end of the year, the year over year sales for PlayStation 4 in Japan are going to be relatively stagnant. However, we all know that what really drives the market in Japan is handheld gaming, and and the PlayStation Vita has actually sold only half as well this year as it did last year in Japan. Now I know the rest of the world has thought that the Vita was basically dead on arrival, but it has had a nice run in Japan, and it's kind of surprising to see the PlayStation Vita actually tapering off so quickly in Japan, especially when you factor in that the 3DS in Japan is only down about 2 or 3% year over year. Um, so if you look at Japan overall, I think it's pretty logical to suggest that the Nintendo Switch is having a big impact on Sony's business in the region. And while Sony is very popular in many countries of the world, um, nowhere is it more important for uh, for Sony to be uh, popular than in its home country. And this is because in your home country, um, when it happens to be Japan, this is where a lot of the game developers are who make compelling single player type experiences, and it really helps when you have them on board to create a variety. You don't want to be stuck in a situation where you're basically the Microsoft Xbox, which tends to they'll get ports of like the really the larger AAA games that come out of Japan, but you're not seeing a lot of content from companies that make really good games on a budget, like Atlas, for example. Sony had a really good thing going in Japan where they would attract a Japanese developer, to make a game for them, who would implement cross-play and make the game available on both PlayStation 4 and on the Vita. So, looking forward, the Vita is really becoming a extinct product in Japan, and Sony could be a little bit in trouble in the region if they don't replace the Vita with something that's going to be competitive in that market. I mean, one of the main things that people are thinking about right now in terms of the PlayStation 4 is, well, it continues to grow because it continues to, sell a large volume of consoles. However, Sony, I think, is looking at growth a little bit differently than maybe the average person, and certainly their shareholders are looking at it differently. Sony's stock has had a very good run these past couple of years, and that's mostly been due to them downgrading and downsizing other aspects of their business and becoming more of a PlayStation-centric company. So for Sony to continue to please investors, what they're looking for that PlayStation brand to continue to actually increase in profits each year, and looking at it year over year. So just continuing to sell consoles, but having their consumer base, some of them buying Nintendo Switch products and possibly losing a little bit of their attention and not having them continually buy the same volume of games for the PlayStation 4 is something that Sony is going to want to avoid. I think Nintendo is much more of a threat to Sony than Microsoft is. Microsoft has come out publicly and stated and acknowledged that they don't have the first-party support really to compete against Sony directly, and they need to improve in this area. But Microsoft has problems in certain regions of the world where their brand is just not something that people gravitate towards. Japan, they've got almost nothing in terms of a market, and they're not nearly as successful in Europe as Microsoft is in the United States. So when you consider that the impact that the Switch is starting to have on PlayStation 4 has been somewhat limited, but you have to keep in mind that the initial sell-through of Switch consoles for the first 2 or 3 months is going to be mostly to your classic Nintendo fan who buys every Nintendo system and purchase these early on. But we're now getting past that, and shipments are starting to heavily increase now over Christmas. And the Switch is appealing to a broad range of gamers who want to play, traditional games and have the flexibility to play those games in handheld mode or in console mode. That concept, love it or hate it, has resonated with customers. It's resonated to such a point where Nintendo is now planning on increasing shipments next year from the roughly 12 to 13 million units in year one to 25 to 30 million units in year two. So you have to imagine if Vita continues to take backwards steps in Japan, which is highly likely, and the Switch ends up selling the way all of the prognosticators are expecting it to sell, which is to sell like gangbusters in the next calendar year, that's going to end up chipping away at Sony, both in hardware sales and also in engagement with their consumers, because a lot of the people buying Switches are going to be PlayStation owners, and you know how it goes. A person buys a Switch, and then chances are they really fall in love with the experience, and then it becomes hard to imagine purchasing a game on their other system when you could buy it on the Switch and be able to play it at any time. Most gamers these days, like the consumers that are buying these products, are part of a family unit. And I know sometimes it seems like the most hardcore gamers out there take a bit of an insular approach to how they view the marketplace, and they think that every gamer out there is single, and they don't have all of these extra factors in their life. But that's not the case for the market at large. And the fact that the PlayStation has become very, very popular as a streaming device helps bring in more customers to purchase the PlayStation. But the problem is that you buy it and then the family ends up taking it over. You bought it to play, Uncharted, Last of Us, all of these great games that Sony has, the third-party games. But then after a while, you realize that your wife and your kids are dominating the system, are watching movies on Netflix, or they're watching TV shows, and they're occupying the TV, and the system is tethered to that TV, and you just don't have as much access to it as you'd like. So the freedom that the Switch provides, I believe, will lead to core experiences like Elder Scrolls and other third-party titles being purchased on Switch, even when the graphics aren't as good as they are on the PlayStation 4. So Sony has a problem, and here's what they basically said. At our gaming business, sales of PlayStation 4 are strong heading into the holidays, but we can't ignore the Nintendo Switch, which has also captured consumers' attention. Traditionally, Sony has made competitive products. Like when Nintendo was the first company to popularize the analog stick, starting with Mario 64 on the N64 and the other games that followed it, it ended up being something that people enjoyed, and it opened up new possibilities for games. And Sony ended up introducing analog sticks into their current console by releasing the DualShock controller. The original controller for PlayStation actually was was basically like a Super Nintendo controller with a second layer of shoulder buttons, and then they just added Rumble, which something that Nintendo also popularized, and they added the analog sticks where there was room for them on the controller. Um, of course, when it came to the Wii being very, very successful, they kind of waited and waited, but eventually they did come out with a competitive product in the PlayStation Move. I think in that case, they didn't really need to, but they just kind of felt like they wanted to do it anyways. They The markets at that point in time were very, very different. The Wii expanded audience was playing games that weren't the same type of games that you would traditionally find on a PlayStation system. However, with the Switch, um, if you look at the game sales, you're not seeing uh, party game compilations and Wii-like fitness type games uh, being successful. The system is being purchased to play traditional games. Um, the only maybe party game that's doing okay, and it's not really doing that great, is One to Switch. But you have to keep in mind this was a launch title, it's a budget title, and it's only, I believe, approached 1 million sold. We're not talking about a hit like Wii Sports or anything in that range whatsoever. So Sony's going to have to react. It's just a question of how they plan on doing that. Most logically, one would expect that Sony will do what they've always done and basically come out with a competitive product that's similar to the Switch, but that poses some pretty major challenges. Um, the other option is to just stick with what they have right now and take Nintendo seriously and not ignore Nintendo in a different way. And I think they can do that by making exclusivity deals. Like I say, their bigger concern right now is trying to keep games off of the Switch than it would be to keep games off of Microsoft. There's people who believe that there's actually some sort of exclusively not on Switch deal in place for Monster Hunter World. So in that case, I mean, Sony's much more threatened by that game potentially being on Switch than they are on Xbox One, where only a handful of gamers are going to buy it. Um, and so they may continue that strategy, um, and like we may see them strengthen their deal with Square Enix on Final Fantasy VII Remake to make sure that never comes to Switch. We may see them continue to work out deals, and it'll be more challenging to do, but they'll have to maybe work out deals now with a company like Atlas to keep Persona games off of the Switch. So this can have an impact, but it's not going to have a major impact, but it could have at least a small impact on the Switch, and just they need to do things to keep the PlayStation relevant in Japan. Um, the other more challenging and not so much a quick fix approach would be to create something similar to the Switch, but that produces some major challenges for Sony. Um, as we know, the Vita had a little bit of a decent run in Japan, but overall it wasn't very successful, and it never really got to the point where it was getting a steady flow of top-notch retail level experiences. And that was when it was competing against the 3DS. I think the you can only assume that with the success of the Switch and with Nintendo moving in a direction where they will be able to put all of their support of first-party titles into one hybrid system, it's going to be even harder for Sony to grow a new system that is separate from the PlayStation 4. The best case scenario for Sony is that they can deal with some major hurdles and find a way to create a portable PlayStation 4 that acts similarly to the Nintendo Switch. Um, they would have all the games uh, that they have on the PlayStation 4 currently and are coming in the future on a handheld, basically right out of the box. And I think that it would help them to keep um, some of the PlayStation consumers from buying a Switch if they knew that they could play uh, the same games that they're playing on their PlayStation 4 in a handheld mode or on the or in a handheld mode, on the go as well. Um, but the one of the major challenges, if you think that the Nintendo Switch has storage issues, let me tell you, it's going to be much worse for a PlayStation 4 portable system. Uh, since the Switch is its own game library, developers have a target file size to shoot for. So when they're developing a game, or porting a game, they keep this in mind, and they do everything they can to kind of uh, cram the games into a 32 gigabyte or less uh, file size. But this isn't the case for PlayStation 4 games. They've never had to deal with that issue. So the games that are on the system take up quite a bit of storage space. And to think about coming out with a handheld that has 512 gigabytes of storage space to make this feasible at all is beginning to sound very, very expensive. I'm thinking that Sony would likely try and get away with 256 gigabytes at the minimum, but there's going to be some challenges to that. I guess the best case scenario is that the dock that it comes with has extra storage space, so you can easily um, store a bunch of games on there, and then maybe one or two titles you can quickly sync to the console when you want to use it in handheld mode. Um, but again, this is just one of the challenges. The other challenge in that regard is it's not going to be able to play Blu-rays. There's no way you're coming out with a handheld that can have a Blu-ray. So, and I don't think that for such a kind of sideshow niche product, like I just don't see companies going back and re-releasing games onto 64 gigabyte cartridges. I would imagine they would likely um, not use retail at all for this product. It would be digital only, which you know can be a limiting factor for Sony in terms of their potential to market the system. Retailers aren't that excited about just carrying a system um, without being able to and make any profits off of the game sales at retail. Um, so that's one of the more major issues I see. The other issue is simply um, that they're not going to be able to shrink down the Jaguar CPU, um, at least not at this time, and get that to work on a mobile device. Um, but so they would end up having to do is go to a new architecture It could still be something x86, and AMD does have a very powerful low wattage um, x86 process now, that you're starting to see show up in laptops and the like, and it's considerably more powerful than the PlayStation 4, or at least the base model. So this is something that could potentially be used, and I'm not the biggest technical guru out there, but I would imagine if they would have to develop insanely good tools that would allow companies to maybe patch their games in order to run on a PlayStation 4 handheld, but the patch would not be as simple as doing a patch for the PlayStation 4 Pro, where the architecture is basically the same. It's just overclocked, right? Um, but maybe they could come up with something where games could be patched, and it certainly wouldn't be as challenging as doing a complete port, but would be somewhere in between the challenge of a port and the minor challenge of a PlayStation 4 Pro patch. That's probably the best case scenario. Now, in that case, I don't think every game would get a patch, but a lot of, like, some of the older stuff would get patches, and likely if it took off, the new games would receive patches day and date. And then at the end of the day, it comes down to pricing, and I think that they would be wise to not sell the system with a dock as the only option. They should sell the system as a handheld for people that just want to buy the handheld, and then have the dock sold separately. And that way, they could end up putting something on the market that had pretty good specs, um, and had a comparable price, at least to get started, to the Switch, maybe $50 more expensive. I think they could come up with something like that for, like, let's say $349 US, that had 256 gigabytes of storage, but the dock would be sold separately, and it wouldn't have all the technology that the Joy-Cons have. It would likely just be a handheld with the idea that later on somebody might buy a dock and a DualShock controller, to use it in console mode on their television set. At the end of the day, I don't see Sony having a major ability to do something about the Nintendo Switch. But, they're a crafty company, and time will tell. I think that pretty much sums it up for today. Talk to you guys later.